Yeah, I'm Ken Terry with Dolby Laboratories. I also happen to be a task group leader of an AES group that we're looking at streaming of audio metadata, and so some of the topics I'll be talking about tie into that work, and I'll explain what it is. My talk is specifically about audio metadata transport for live applications, because there's a lot of metadata in file workflows, but this talk is about how we get it across live workflows, particularly with IP. Just a quick bit of background. I'm going to do a bit of background as a primer to get into where we are with IP, because it makes sense of where we've come from, and just to use a few definitions, in terms of audio metadata, what we're interested in. Metadata is a broad term, and even audio metadata is a broad term, but as in the context that we're talking about, it's basically anything outside of the PCM waveforms. Now, there's other ways of transmitting it, like coded signals, so I'll use that term loosely, but we're talking about metadata that's other than the signal itself. Now, some of it's static metadata. That's things like program titles, things you can send ahead of time that aren't tightly timed. You might want to time it with the start of the thing. Some of them are about number of channels that might be fixed in a system. But what we're particularly interested in this new category of what we call dynamic time-varying metadata. And a lot of next-generation audio, things like spatial audio, some of the codecs you hear about for ATSC 3.0, MPEG-H, and AC4, to fully exercise their features, they need what we call dynamic metadata. That's metadata that changes during the program. In terms of moving objects, it might be spatial location that's actively moving, like you'd hear in a cinema application. It could be dialogue levels, lots of different things. And the key requirement is a lot of those kinds of metadata require timing. You need to be closely aligned to the audio content, sometimes down to the sample. Some of it can be a little loose, but we need that timing, and that's critical. And the other requirement is a lot of this new metadata is what we call required. A lot of today's workflows work without metadata. You can get a 5.1 system on, I'll talk about that, and you can do it without metadata or fixed metadata. You know what your channels are, you know where they are, you basically know what the program is. But a lot of these new next generation systems, they won't work without metadata, particularly spatial audio, but other words, where the channels are not fixed, they're changing over time. And so what we want is a transport path that handles dynamic metadata that you must have to reproduce it, so you can rely on that chain. This is just a simple diagram to show where we are on the picture. The big picture is we want metadata to flow all the way through a system to consumer, but what we're talking about today is IP streams that are used in production. So however you capture that data, somebody's mixed a program, we want to get that program to however it's emitted. It might go over terrestrial, it might go over the web, a lot of different ways to get it to consumers. Could go over, even fixed media like Blu-rays. But if it's a live production or live content, that's what we're interested in this presentation. And in current, I'd say current, as of now, we're starting to get into it, but what we've been facing for the last few years is a structure for live production where basically stereo and 5.1 are the norms. It's hard to get anything in live production above 5.1. And our experience with metadata, it's really hard to get metadata to work in these systems from an audio standpoint. And but what does work is something called SMPTE 337, and that's something we've been using for the last few years. We needed this to get through ATSC 1.0 to get 5.1 on the air, and it's a way to use non-PCM data in AES3, and it's a way to get data over a standard digital audio channel, but it requires the use of AES3. And so that's what's kind of come into use. And so what we've done in the last 2 to 3 years is we've defined 2 standards to send advanced audio metadata over AES3 channels via SMPTE 337. One of them's called SMPTE 2109, that's just published this year, and it's a general framework for sending model. It uses a payload-based model similar to how codecs use it, and it's a general framework for putting audio in. It does not find any metadata itself. There's a separate RDD that finds some metadata that goes in it that's optimized for it. That's an RDD, but the standard itself is open to any metadata. There's another standard that's almost a publication. It's currently a draft. It should be published by the end of the year. That's a standard specific to serial ADM. Now, ADM is widely used in file formats, audio definition model, and this is the serialized version of that. So that's a standard. Both of these work over SMPTE 337, and both of these tie into how we can make things work today. So this is how it works in what I call legacy non-IP system today. So say you're using SDI or another way of transporting AS3. You can use either one of those standards to tunnel data in 337, and once it's in the AS3 domain, then you're free to go where AES3 goes. Now with the caveat, of course, that you can't treat it as audio, but that's a problem that we've dealt with over the last 15, 20 years with coded audio, and generally it's reliable. We can make it work, we can make the signaling work. So we know from experience we can get coded audio through these systems, and so if we can get the coded audio as data, we know we can get this. And so it can flow wherever it flows. It can be embedded in SDI, we know it can go in MPEG-2 transport streams, it can go in MADI, basically anywhere AES3 goes. And so for today's legacy systems that use SDI, that's how we're getting things on air. And there's been several trials over the last 2 years, both here and in Europe, getting some sports broadcasts going. So we know this works. It's kind of a rudimentary phase where it's in, but we know it works and it's reliable. So that feeds into where we're going in the future. Now, what you're interested in is how we're going to do this over IP. So, as you all know, AS67 is all about interoperability with audio over IP. So it's an interchange format. It says, how do we interchange digital audio, PCM audio, amongst different disparate systems? And it's what the goal is, rather than having multiple ways of sending PCM audio, we have one interchange standard that can make them all talk together. It's beautiful, but as I'll point out in a second, AS67 is not AS3 transport, it's raw PCM transport. What it's missing is the metadata component. And so what about the metadata interchange? That's what we're going to address today. How do we get metadata to work with digital audio over IP? So this also ties in not just to audio over IP, but where we are in the situation with audio and video over IP. And the first step in that domain was 2022-6. There was also a MPEG-2 transport variant of it, but basically that's saying put SDI on the wire. Well, if you can put SDI on the wire with the whole signal, including embedded audio, you can get AS3 audio on the wire. So that's a step in the right direction. But where the eye on the prize really is right now is the 2110 suite. And as you know, that's where things are going with broadcast for production, particularly for video. But the ones of relevance here for audio are two particular standards. They're both now fully standardized and published and in practice. Dash 30, of course, is the SMPTEized version of AS67, so that's the PCM audio. But particularly for what I mentioned before, where 337 is used for coded audio, it was brought up in the SMPTE group that we needed a way to get coded audio over IP as well. So again, rather than having different IP carriage mechanisms for sending audio, coded audio over the 2110 suite, it says, let's use a common method. In fact, there's one already in use over AS3 via 337. Let's define a standard for that. Ravenna happened to have a solution that worked for that, Ravenna AM824, that they already had implemented. It works, they proposed it, and everybody said, great, let's use that. So basically, 2110-31 is a standardized version of Ravenna AM824 that carries the full AES3 signal. And the beauty of it is it supports the non-PCM data that Dash 30 doesn't. So it's a way of getting coded audio. And I should mention on the video side, there's a similar standard coming out, Dash 22 I believe it is, which is a standard for coded video. So there's an equivalent on the video side with that, and that'll be of relevance at the end of my presentation. So with that, this is the way that we can get on air with IP right now with dynamic time varying audio metadata. And so it's basically using the same way we do it, and again, this is compatible with legacy systems in the sense we're using the same AS3 signal, and we can tunnel it in these transmission methods over IP. I mentioned 2022-6, we can get SDI over IP, there's one for MPEG-2 transport, and of course Dash 31, that's the main method. And so, that's great. The difference is though, we'd really like to send the audio itself over Dash 30. You can of course send audio over Dash 31, but that's not the ideal. The ideal is stick with AS67 and Dash 30 and send the PCM audio that way. So the question was, well, is this going to be the standard in the future? Where are we going with this? And so some of the limitations that came up is, it's great we can put this metadata in here, but we're still tunneling in AS3. So you have a fixed, rather high bitrate audio signal for potentially a very small amount of metadata, or potentially you might have a huge amount of metadata that's very bursty and won't fit in that fixed rate pipe. So as a fixed rate pipe, it's not ideal for this. It works today, it's compatible with legacy, but it's not necessarily the best solution going forward for tying, for audio metadata to go with AS67 or 21-30. So we came up with this idea. Said, wait, let's skip the embedding in AES3 and 337. Let's just put it straight into IP packets. And so the initial idea, as proposed, and this going back a couple of years, is we said, take what's in this 21i container, which, as I mentioned before, is an open container for putting metadata in. It doesn't define the metadata, it's just a container. And there happened to be an existing RFC for mapping this into IP RTP transport. And so we proposed a standard within AES so that it would benefit the whole AES community, and that standard got approved and is under work now, and that standard is AES X242. So that's the concept, and the idea was, let's standardize this in AES, so it's the standard method of sending audio metadata with AES67, and then when that's done, we can say, make a SMPTE constrained version that works in the SMPTE suite. So AES is compatible with SMPTE in the same way that -30 is compatible with AES67. And so this frees us up from the constraints of the AES3 mapping, and again, provides full support. Once you're in IP, your restrictions about what you can do with metadata go away. So that's what was proposed, and this is the project. If you go online to the AES website and read the project proposal, and you can see what some of the requirements are. And so we did discuss initially, does it make sense to try and modify AES67, and there was a resounding sentiment, no, that's a bad idea, let's not mess with AES67. But there was agreement that keeping a separate RTP stream is a good way, particularly the experience with 2110 suite, where we have a lot of separate RTP streams that are well timed. We know that we can make that work. So we said, let's define a separate RTP stream that's sent in parallel with AES67, and it'll work with any kind of AES67 application. And again, it's open any kind of metadata, so depending on what your application is, you can put the right kind of metadata in. And of course, in broadcast, we might be interested in a particular set like this, ADM, serial ADM metadata, but in other applications for music recording, it may be a completely different set of metadata. So we're trying to be open to any kind of metadata. So that work was started in this AES working group that I chair, SE0212-R. It was started a couple of years ago, and we've got a draft. It's not a public draft, but it's a draft that we are working against. And we're hoping we can get something targeted for publication by the end of next year. It might take a little longer, but I think this time next year we'll be in pretty good shape of where we are technically with this. However, I mentioned the video guys. Well, they have a similar corollary in the coded audio and coded video characteristics. Well, it turns out they have a similar problem on the video metadata side. For those of you who are familiar with video, there's going back to the history of analog signals, there's the vertical and horizontal intervals, which in SDI space got used for data, and that's of course how we transmit embedded audio, but lots of other data in this ancillary space. And so when the 2110 suite was created, it says, well, how do we transmit the entire SDI signal, and ancillary data being a big part of that. They went off and said, let's define a method strictly for carrying these packets, and that's what 2110-40 is. It's a way of carrying these ancillary data packets through IP via this RFC for RTP streaming of that. And again, it's specific for this ANT structure. It's not directly tied to an SDI signal. You're free to define it any way, but it is limited by this structure. In particular, the user data words are mixed. So if you want to send a large amount of metadata, you have to pack it in these packets. It has to meet that requirement. Again, not ideal. So some observant people said, wait, we have a similar situation. Why are we constrained by these ancillary packets? And so a project was proposed, -41, fast metadata for short, which is saying, let's just send arbitrary metadata without the complexity of this ancillary packing structure. And so it turns out the two projects have very similar requirements. In fact, audio is in the scope of the fast metadata. The fast metadata project is a little more open. It's not just video metadata, but any kind of metadata that might be associated with a media stream. And audio is one of those kinds. So there's some overlap in scope. And so again, X242, we've limited the scope strictly to audio metadata and strictly to AES67, whereas -41 is a bit more open, but there's a lot of similarity. So we decided, hey, let's have a liaison, let's see if we can work things out. So the revised version of this, where it's under discussion, and again, this is to be determined, but we'll see where this heads. But we're hoping maybe we can have a version that's compatible with -41, and we'll see how that happens. It would be ideal if we can share a common streaming format, whatever that is. Either way, it ends up working for both applications and can free us of these constraints of the tunneling. On the audio side, frees us from the constraints of AES3. So if you're interested in this topic, this is all under active discussion. I encourage you to get involved in our group here in AES or the group in SMPTE and provide your input. And particularly on the audio side, we're looking for user requirements. That's something we're working on now. Is we're working on the use cases for X242. I come from a broad background working on live broadcast, and I'm fairly familiar with those needs, and that's a lot of what's in the discussion here in this forum here. But we want to support all the applications that go with AES System 7. And you'll see on the show floor a lot of people doing advanced audio things with production tools and mixers. And some of those protocols, they use a different data language. They don't use serial ADM or others. They use MIDI protocols or MIDI-like protocols or open sound control-like protocols. So there was requirements around that. We've been getting some input from live sound that, for sound reinforcement, live applications, there may be some different requirements around that. So we're basically looking at all the use cases of where AES67 is applied in practice and say, hey, are we defining the right standard for streaming that's going to meet the requirements of these applications, whatever they might be. So if you're involved in any of these, we would appreciate input. We're looking for input in our group, SEO212R, for input on these applications to make sure that what we come out with is defined. Now, of course, once we get to the stage of publishing a standard, it'll go out for comment and it'll be freely open for the public to look at, but we'd rather consider these before it gets to that standpoint and if at all possible. So if you're not involved in live broadcast and one of these others, your feedback is appreciated. And so as I said, this task group is ongoing today, and as well as in SMPTE, your participation and input is encouraged. You can come see me directly or join the group. And I also mentioned that we've got some demos working, and over here, Andreas, our friend Andreas here in the Ravenna booth, we've worked with him to have a streaming audio demo of what's today's current solution for IP streaming, which is the 2110-31 solution, where we're sending the embedded data with serial ADM over -31, and he can show you a little demonstration of that working. So I think that's the end of my presentation. Oh, yeah, I wanted to follow up. These are just some of the relevant standards that are involved in, that I've mentioned today. The last one, the ITU, that's the actual standard defining the metadata, and RDD49 as well under SMPTE defines metadata. The rest of these are involved in transport, and these are the ones, if you're interested in this area and this topic, what's going on, and again, most of these are published, but X242 and -41 are still in development, and 2116 is almost published, so that kind of gives you an overview of everything. So that in a nutshell is where we're at with this streaming metadata, and we've got some solutions that work today to get on air, and we think we have a good idea where we can go and make this, and so the promise for IP is that we can have unlimited numbers of audio channels, virtually unlimited numbers of audio channels, and virtually unlimited metadata, freeing applications up, so we're no longer restricted by things we've been restricted in the past. So thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take them now or afterwards. So.